Hello and welcome to the Shepheard Walwyn podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Well, it's good to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
So Michael, I think you have one of probably the most extraordinary upbringings and journeys into economics. I just wondered if you can give our listeners just some sense of how you got from being the godson of Leon Trotsky all the way to what I consider to be probably the most important economist in the world today.
There's no direct causality there that could have been anticipated. I never studied economics in college because I went to school at the University of Chicago, where we knew that there were some students at the university who were at the business school, and they were such strange people that we never even thought of going near them. There was something otherworldly about them, something abstract. So my degree was in German history and history of culture, because the head of the history of culture department was 𝐞𝐝𝐢𝐤𝐢𝐨𝐧, and he was a German professor. And at the time, my intention was to become a musician, and I had to learn German in order to read the works of Heinrich Schenker in music theory. My teachers were German, and in the history of culture, most of the books that I was reading were all in German. And the German professors were also head of the comparative literature department and other departments, and it was just it meant that I could take all the courses cafeteria style at the university that I wanted. So then I had to go to work when I graduated. Went to work for a while as a public relations person for Technical Society, a publisher near a block away from the university. And then went to work for Free Press that was headed by Jerry Kaplan, who was a Trotskyist, a follower of Max Shachtman. And he wanted to send me to New York to help set up Free Press there. When I came to New York, right after I came to New York, Trotsky's widow died, and Max Shachtman was the executor of her estate. And he thought I should go into publishing by myself. And I'd already had the copyrights for George Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist. And I tried to get funding for a publishing company with Trotsky's works and other works. I'd been writing a history of music and art theory. And needless to say, I didn't get any funding because nobody was at all interested in publishing the works of Trotsky. I even tried to get Dwight Eisenhower to write the introduction to his military papers. Wouldn't work. So I happened to meet the father of a girlfriend of one of my schoolmates, Gavin McFadgen, and his name was Terence McCarthy. And he was the first American translator of the first history of economic thought that was written. And that was Karl Marx's Theories of Surplus Value, where he reviews the whole of classical economics. And he said he would help guide me in economic thinking. I'd get a PhD in economics and go to work on Wall Street to see how the world worked. And but I had to read all of the bibliography in Marx's Theory of Surplus Value. So I had to begin buying the books and ended up working with one of the reprinters, Gus Kelly, who was reprinting many of the classical economists. He was a socialist publisher, and there were other dealers in America, Samuel M. Barris, Sidney Millman, and I began buying all of the 19th century classical economic books that I could, since that was the only way that I could get copies. And there was very little appearance in classical economics in school. I had to take classes in the evening. I began by working at a bank for 3 years, the Savings Banks Trust Company, which was the central bank, a commercial bank, but the commercial bank acting as a central bank for the savings banks that in America finance mortgages. All of the savings are reinvested in mortgages. So for 3 years, my job was to track the real estate market, the mortgage market, interest rates, the funding of mortgages, the growth of assets by the savings banks, and that was compound interest. All of the growth in savings in the New York savings banks in the early 1960s were the crediting of dividends. So you'd have a step function like that, all going up exponentially. There was hardly any new saving. It's as if you just left a given amount of savings in 1945 and let the amount of savings rise exponentially. And then all of this increase in savings was recycled into the real estate market. And the New York banks wanted to extend their market, so they couldn't just keep bidding up New York prices. So they won the right to lend out of state. They wanted to lend to Florida, especially. And so you had, my job was basically seeing that real estate prices were whatever a bank would lend. And at that time in America, banks would not lend you a mortgage if the debt service exceeded 25% of your income. And you had to put down usually 30% of the down payment, but possibly 10%. So housing was affordable. You could buy a really nice house for $20,000 or $30,000. Now it costs $200,000 to buy just a one-room apartment in a condominium. But I bought a house for $1 down. Ostensibly, it was $45,000. I took out a mortgage from Chase for half the price, and the other half was a purchase money mortgage. So it was easy. Anybody could get a house in New York at that time, and housing was still affordable. Well, after I finished my PhD courses, I changed jobs, and my real interest at the time was international finance, the balance of payments. So I went to work at Chase Manhattan as their balance of payments economist. This is at a time when balance of payments economics and really balance sheet analysis was not taught in schools. It was very specialized. And I realized when I went through the training that what I learned, especially in monetary theory, had nothing to do at all with what I was learning in practice. For instance, in the monetary theory, that was the era of Milton Friedman in the 60s and 70s with money theory. And he thought that when you create more money, it increases consumer prices. Well, I thought that that obviously was not how things worked at all. When banks create money, they don't lend for people to spend. There are a few personal loans for spending, but almost always 80% of bank loans in America, as in England, are mortgage loans. They lend against property already in place. They also lend for corporate mergers and acquisitions, and by the 1980s, this meant corporate takeovers. They lend to increase asset prices, not consumer prices. And just to show you, before we go on, the problem is that you could say that money creation actually lowers consumer prices, because of all the bank credit creation, most of it, 80%, is to increase housing prices. Then banks, in order to increase their loan market, will lend more and more and more money against every piece of real estate, whether it's residential real estate or commercial property ownership. And pretty soon, as you know, that by 2008, you could buy property with no money down at all and take 100% mortgage, sometimes even 102 or 103%, so you'd have enough money to pay the closing fees. And the government then said, instead of limiting the amount of money that a bank could lend against income, the proportion of income devoted to mortgage service that was federally guaranteed increased to 43%. Well, that's a lot more than 25%. That's 18% of personal income more in 2008 than in the 1960s had to go simply to pay mortgage interest in order to get a house. So I realized that this was deflationary. The more money you had to spend on mortgage interest to buy a house, as land and real estate was financialized, the less you had to spend on goods and services. And this was one of the big problems that was slowing the economy down. Well, it was obvious that to me that that rent was being turned into interest, and that was the phrase that was used. Rent is for paying interest. If I talked about with various developers about buying buildings, they said, "Well, we don't. We try to buy our buildings without any money at all. The banks will lend us the money to buy a building, and they calculate how much is your rental income going to be. Okay, that rental income will carry how much of a bank loan at a given percentage, and we calculate how much of a given bank loan this rental income will do, and we'll lend you the money in it." So basically, the rent was financialized, and the role that was played in the 19th century by landlords is now played by banks. In the 19th century, the problem was absentee landlords were the heirs of the warlords who conquered England or other European countries in the Middle Ages. Had a hereditary rent. Well, now rent has been democratized, but it's been democratized on credit, because obviously the only way that if you're a wage earner or an investor that you can afford to buy a whole building is on credit, and all of us, and that has transformed finance. It has transformed real estate into a financial vehicle, so that that's what rent is for paying interest means. So I found that there's a symbiotic sector: finance, insurance, and real estate. The FIRE sector is basically the central driver of the economy, and it's basically a financialized economy. Very active lobbyists. Most policy is made. Real estate tax policy in America is made at the local level these days, because the financial sector, after the income tax was introduced and after World War I, basically has made commercial real estate tax exempt by the pretense that buildings depreciate in value instead of rise in price. The pretense that they wear out, even though normal landlords pay about 10% of the rent income for repairs and upgrades and to keep the building from wearing out. So that today in New York, and I'm sure in London too, the older a building is, the better it's built, as the real estate interests, the developers have dumbed down and basically crapified building codes, so that the newer the building, the worse it's and more shoddily it's built. They call shoddy buildings luxury real estate, meaning it's built with really not very thick walls. And I think the junkiest building in New York is Trump Towers, which is sort of the model of shoddiness, which they call luxury and very high price. So basically, I saw the importance of finance and real estate. None of that was discussed in the university at all. The pretense is that money is created by banks lending to people who build factories and employ labor to produce more, and somehow credit is all productive because it finances productive investment. Well, that was the hope in the 19th century, and it actually was the reality in Germany and in Central Europe, where you had banking becoming industrialized. But after World War II, all of this stopped. You had a snap back into the Anglo-Dutch-American kind of banking, which was really just merchant banking. It was banking to lend against assets already in place. So I realized that the story of the statistics that I worked on were the exact opposite of what I was taught, and I simply had to go through the motions of going through the orals and writing about this. I wrote my dissertation on the history of economic thought because anything that I'd write about the modern economy would simply drive the professors nutty. Needless to say, none of the academic professors I had ever actually worked in the real world, and it was all very theoretical. So that basically is how I came to realize that the whole 19th century fight, for 100 years, we can call it the long 19th century, from the French Revolution all the way up to World War I, from the French physiocrats to Adam Smith to Ricardo and Malthus and John Stuart Mill, then to Marx and Simon Patton and Thorstein Veblen. The essence of classical economics was its value and price theory. And the whole purpose of value and price theory was to define the excess of market price over actual cost value. And that difference was economic rent. So the whole essence of classical economics had a political campaign, and the political campaign was that of industrial capitalism. And it was a radical campaign. Industrial capitalism was radical because it realized that in order to make Britain or France or Germany or any country competitive with other countries, you had to get rid of the landlord class and its demands for economic rent. And you had to get rid of monopolies and economic rent. You had to get rid of all payments of income that were not necessary for production to take place. All elements, you wanted to bring prices in line with the actual cost value of production and not include this rake-off to unproductive investment, unproductive labor. And that was that was land rent, monopoly rent, and financial interest charges. Those were the three categories of rent that were the focus of all of classical economics at the time. And that led to a political reform. How do you get rid of the landlord class? Well, you don't simply say they're not necessary, because the landlord class says, well, what are you going to do about it? Well, the proponents of industrial capitalism said, we've got to, given the Constitution of England, France, America, we've got to have the government power pass laws to free economies from economic rent. And in order to do that, we need democratic reform. We need to build up, in England, you had to build up the House of Commons over the House of Lords. And this became a constitutional crisis in 1909 and 1910, when the House of the Commons Parliament passed a land tax, and that was rejected, as I'm sure you know, by the House of Lords. And the crisis was resolved by saying the Lords could never again reject a revenue act passed by the House of Commons. So that political reform was part and parcel with the economic theory defining rent as what is the unnecessary cost of production. Well, this seemed to be very, very productive, and but it began to falter already by 1848, when you had revolutions in almost every European country. And the revolutions really were not fully democratic in the sense of they weren't really for labor, wage labor, which was the bulk of society. It was sort of a bourgeois revolution. It was all for land reform. It was all for getting rid of the landed aristocracy and the special privileges that the aristocracy held, but it was to, they were not very interested in reforms of helping consumers, helping labor's working conditions, shortening the work week, shortening the workday, promoting safety. There was nothing really about public health or public social infrastructure spending. So things began to falter by 1848. They still made progress through the balance of the 19th century. And by the time World War I broke out in 1914, it looked like the world was moving towards socialism. And almost everybody in the 19th century, across the political spectrum, whatever you were doing, that was called socialism. And socialism meant essentially you collect the economic rent and you get rid of the landlords, and getting rid of the aristocracy would create a viable industrial economy. So you had libertarian socialism, you had Marxist socialism, you had anarchist socialism, you had industrial socialism, you had Christian socialism. There were, you could have a bookshelf of books, all with this, and everybody wanted, that was a label that everybody was looking at. The question is, what kind of socialism were you going to have? And in a way, that was what World War, the aftermath of World War I was fought about. And it was largely triggered by the Russian Revolution, which unfortunately went rather tragically wrong under Stalin, which gave socialism and communism a bad name, but it had a good name in England after World War II. And in America, already in the 1930s, as a result of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal that saved capitalism by investing in public infrastructure. I can give you an example of the kind of where theory was in the 1890s in the United States. The industrial interests in America had a problem once the Civil War ended in 1865. How are you going to, they wanted to create an industrial society that was going to be a fair society with rising living standards. How do you do that without training people? You need to train people in a university. You had to teach them economics and how it worked. Well, the main universities in America were religious colleges, or founded to train the clergy. Yale, Harvard, Princeton, and all of them were British free trade theory, a trivialization of economic theory. So the business interests and the government said, we've got to have reality economics. So we're not going to try to reform the existing universities. The economics departments are unreformable. So we're going to create new universities. And all through America, each state was given a land grant. And the land grant was to enable them to create their own universities where they would teach a reality economics, and they would teach economic history, and they would teach how the world actually worked. And most of all, they'd treat protectionist doctrine. How do you create a society, an economy that is more efficient than other economies? Well, the first business school in America was the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And the first economics professor was Simon Patten, a protectionist. And Simon Patten said, well, though, if you're going to make industrial products outcompete those of England and Europe, now what you need is public infrastructure spending. So you need as much of the cost of living as possible to not to be paid by the employers, but to be paid by the government. For instance, we're going to have public roads and canals, and the roads will lower the cost of doing business. And every time you build a road or a railroad, you're going to have the land values going up, and you can simply self-finance all of these by by taxing themselves. And you'll have public education, and that will be free, so that you don't have, like today, if you have a job, you have to earn enough money to pay an enormous student debt of a few $100,000. Well, if the government would provide free education, you wouldn't have to pay workers enough to pay the student debt. Today, 18% of America's national income is from medical insurance. Well, if you had, as England had public health after World War II, if you had public health here and a public medicine, or as Bernie Sanders advocates, then you wouldn't have to pay workers a high enough salary to afford this enormous medical expense. Well, already in England, they realized this in the 1870s and 80s when Benjamin Disraeli campaigned as a conservative for health, all is health. So the movement towards public infrastructure, towards government spending, was led by the industrialists, not by the working class. It was the industrialists themselves that wanted a strong government into the picture. And the common denominator of politics, from, again, Adam Smith through all of the 19th century commentators, was in order to free economies from the unnecessary economic rent, to free them from unearned income, to free them from the free lunch, you have to have a government strong enough to take on the vested interests in the essentially the landlord class in the House of Lords and the financial class behind it. Well,
and so just to clarify there, Michael, I think what you're saying is, I know in some of your writing you talk about the view of government or the public sector was it was a fourth means of production. So you got land, labor, capital, and that
was the word that Simon Patton used. That a government infrastructure is a fourth means of production. But what makes it different from profits and wages is if you're a wage earner, you want to make as high a wage as possible. If you're a capitalist, you want to make as high a profit as possible. But the job of public investment as a means of production is not to make an income, not to do what it's done under Thatcher and Tony Blair, not to treat public utilities, education and health, as profit-making opportunities, but you want to measure their productivity by how much they lower the cost of doing business and the cost of living to the economy at large. So,
and what that allows a country to do, so if you're good at, if as a nation, if we get together and say, right, how could we educate our people, lower the cost of transportation, so we've got a mobile workforce, all those things, we can then start to compete against other nations who are ahead of us, who may have more expensive means of production, and we can actually maintain an advantage, and we're not stuck in a lower level of the economy where we're basically working for someone else. We're actually able to develop ourselves as a nation. And I guess the benefit of us doing it collectively is that we can minimize the cost and use the monopoly power to do efficient services across the board. Is that right?
Yes, but they went further because the protectionists in America said the way to minimize costs, and it may seem an oxymoron, the way you minimize cost is with high wage labor. You raise the wages of labor. You raise the living standards, because high paid labor, highly educated labor, well-fed labor, well-rested labor is more productive than pauper labor. So they said very explicitly, yes, America's going to be a high-wage economy. We're not like Europe, but our high wages are going to provide high enough living standards to provide high labor productivity. And it's our high labor productivity, shorter working day, better working conditions, healthy working conditions, public health, well-educated. That's going to undersell countries that don't have an active public sector.
And Henry Ford being the poster boy for that approach, right, of doubling his employees' salaries and so on.
Yes.
Amazing. Right.
So now, needless to say, the the fight for the kind of democracy that will free economies from economic rent was not easy. And already by the late 1980s, and especially the 1990s, you had the rentiers fighting back. And in America, the fight was led by, I'm blocking it out, Clark, J.B. Clark. There was a movement which today is called neoliberalism, to deny classical economics. Clark said, everything the classical economists have written is wrong. There is no such thing as unearned income. Economic rent does not exist. Whatever a businessman makes, he earns. Whatever a landlord makes, he earns. There is no unearned income. Well, all this came to a head around in 1890. There was a publication, the Journal of Ethics, and Clark translated his books on economics into this article. And it was followed by Simon Patton, the protectionist economics professor, refuting them all and saying there's an attempt by academic economics, especially in New York City, at Columbia University, where Clark had ended up, to fight against the concept of economic rent. And this is really the dividing line. Either you recognize that much of society is the economy is unearned income, and you want to get rid of it, and you want to pass laws that will tax away the unearned income, or better yet, you put natural monopolies into the public domain where the public sector can directly do prices. And of course, that was what Teddy Roosevelt was very shortly going to do with his trust funding.
Michael, I just want to say, reading your work is something of it, because I've got a degree in economics for what it's worth. And I would say it's worth, I said the only valuable thing that I found from getting a degree in economics is that I know resolutely when an economist is talking bullshit. And it's like, well, how do you know that? It's all his lips are moving.
They're an economist, they're talking bullshit. Now, let me make it easy.
Right. And the thing is that reading your work, for example, going back to Thorsten Veblen's work, which was only all he's made it into the, to the mainstream when I was in the 90s getting a degree, was conspicuous consumption. It had nothing to do with absentee landlords or and the profound importance of that. And then I'm looking in J's for Junk Economics, and you talk about free lunch, which is obviously Milton Friedman's. There's no such thing as a free lunch, which by definition, when you look at your work, you prove that actually there is, and that he's having it.
Yeah.
And you say about most businesses ventures seek such free lunches, not entailing actual work or real production costs, to deter public regulation or higher taxation of such rent-seeking recipients of free lunches have embraced Milton Friedman's claim that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And you talk about, even more aggressively, rent extractors accuse governments of taxing their incomes to subsidize freeloaders, pinning the label of free lunches on public welfare recipients, job programs, beneficiaries of higher minimum wage, when the actual antidote to free lunches is to make government strong enough to tax economic rent and keep the potential rent extracting opportunities and natural monopolies in the public domain.
Well, Veblen and Lee indeed was the last great classical economist. He coined the term neoclassical economics, and that's an unfortunate term. When I went to school in my 20s, I thought neoclassical meant, it's a new version of classical economics, and it's not at all. What Veblen meant was, there used to be the old classical economics of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Marx, and that was all about economic rent and exploitation. And neo means there's a new body of completely different post-classical economics pretending to be classical economics, and that is the new classical economics of today. So it was he should have used the word post-classical or anti-classical economics. Or even
is it now even pseudo-classical? Right, so we know that it's
antithetical. Absolutely antithetical. Because if the root of classical value and price theory was to isolate and define economic rent statistically, then denying economic rent denies the whole of value and price theory. And this is where economics became untracked. Unfortunately, it became untracked largely by Henry George, by rejecting classical economics. And George essentially became very quickly a follower of J.B. Clark and accepted this sort of mushy value theory thing and price theory, removing from value theory all elements to cost of production, not analyzing prices simply in terms of consumer demand and what people want, not analyzing what made asset prices, which of course most wealth is asset prices. George became very popular, rightly, as a journalist, wonderful journalism to expose the railroads in California, the railroads as landlords. He wrote a wonderful book on the Irish land question, but then he tried to talk about the whole economy, and he didn't want any competition. He said, economics begins with me. Don't read forget everything Adam Smith in classical economics says, follow me. And he's sort of an early Margaret Thatcher. There's no such thing as society or the economy. All you have to do is tax.
Michael, what are you doing? You're destroying my view of Henry George. Well, the idea that he's an early Margaret Thatcher. How can that possibly be?
Well, here's in two ways. Let me say the first way is remember in the 19th century, in order to have to tax the land rent, you have to take on the most powerful vested interests of all, the real estate interests and the financial interests. And Henry George was a libertarian. He was for small government. He broke with the socialists because he warned that socialism had a potential for authoritarianism. Well, we know he was right in that warning because we saw what happened in Stalinist Russia. But obviously what you want is a government that is strong and democratic, but not authoritarian. And that was the ideal of America. But you had to have a strong enough government so that Teddy Roosevelt could come in and be able to bust the trusts, he could come in and be able to have in 1913-14 the American income tax, that the whole income tax fell on 1% of the population, almost entirely on economic rent, on land rent, on mineral rent, and on monopoly rent for the big corporations. If you're a libertarian, you're for a government too small to take on the vested interests, and you'll never win. You'll end up like the Social Democrats or like today's Labor Party under Mr. Starmer, not be able to be very efficient. So that was the first problem. The second problem was when George said, all you have to do is tax the land and everything else will take care of itself. Well, as you know, he was nominated as a celebrity candidate by the socialist and labor groups in New York City in 1876 to run for mayor. And they gave him the program. You have to have safe housing, workers' housing. You have to have safe working conditions. You have to have food laws that prevent people using poison, like you don't want to use chromium for cake frosting in order to make it yellow. Well, George threw out the whole labor program and said, no, there's only one thing that matters. And that if you tax the land rent, the cakes will take care of themselves. The worker safety and condition will take care of themselves. You don't need socialism, just do land rent. Well, the word panacea came into use in the English language at that time because he didn't see the economy as a whole. And that was the whole tragedy. He was great as a journalist describing rent and the machinations of the railroads and the other people. But once he tried to talk about the economy without really knowing much, without describing how the economy worked as a system, saying there really isn't any economic system. It's just all about land rent. That separated him from the other reformers. And by the time by the 1890s, you had many of reformers in America who were actually inspired by George's journalism in the 70s and early 80s, and the attacks on the oil monopoly, on the Rockefellers, all of this. And they said, what happened to him? What happened? Well, he became a sectarian. He said, he formed his own party and said, we're only going to talk about land rent. And he sort of diverted attention away from how the overall economy works. And if you don't understand how the economy is all about providing a free lunch in one way or another, not to landlords today, but to the financial sector primarily, then you're really not going to address the interests of most of the population. And that's what happened. His party shrunk quite a bit. And all down to the first decade of the 20th century, you had followers of Henry George and socialists going around the country debating each other. Great debates. They really spelled out the whole problem. I wanted to reprint all of these debates somewhere and have them, because it really both the socialists and the Georgists said, well, one thing we can agree on: society is going to go either your way or our way. We're talking about how is the future of the political system and the economic relations and taxes that follow from this system. How are they going to evolve? The socialists, needless to say, focused more and more on labor's working conditions, because they were getting worse and worse in America. You had the fight for labor unionization got quite violent and corrupt. The abuse of consumers, the growth of monopolies, all of these were growing problems. And the socialists said, okay, we're going to focus on these problems. Let's leave the discussion of rent to followers of George. I think that was very unfortunate, because what George did was pry the discussion of economic rent away from the mainstream political discussion, which was socialist. And I found very little interest in today's socialist movement, or the socialist movement 50 years ago, in the land rent issue. They were concerned about international issues, about war, about almost everything except land rent. And today I find the greatest interest in rent theory and translating it into a tax system and an overall economic system to be in China. So that's really where the debate over how are you going to keep the price of housing down by keeping the banking, the financial sector from just trying to capitalize the land rental income into a bank loan. That's the big fight in China today, and to a lesser extent in Russia. Fred Harrison in the early 1990s brought a group of people, including me, over to Russia. We made 2 trips to the Duma. We did everything we could to say, look, Russia, you can have a great advantage to rebuild your industry and make it a productive economy. What you do, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you want to keep housing prices down. You want to give everybody their houses. If you give them all their houses free and clear, they don't have any debt. And then we know that some places are going to be more valuable than others. Then you'll have the lowest priced economy in the world, because in America, the rent can take up to, as I said, 43% of labor's income. Well, there was some pushback from the Russians. To begin with, they said, how can you have rent in a socialist economy? Well, Ted Gwartney, an American real estate appraiser, walked down the street of St. Petersburg with the local mayor and Vladimir Putin was in the meeting, Ted tells me, and he walked down the street and he said, look, it was, I think, a fall or winter day. He said, you'll notice one side of the street is very sunny. The other street is in the shade. That's how the sun is in the northern latitudes in the winter. You notice that everybody is walking on the sunny side of the street. That means that if you're going to have a store, whether it's a bakery or a food store or a restaurant, the store on the sunny side of the street is going to be able to attract more customers and have what we call economic rent more than the other side of the street. Same thing with buildings. They're a very nice apartment building in good repair will be more than that is near a subway is going to be worth more than something that's far away from the subway. Well, the mayor said, well, okay, I get the commercial side of the street, but how do we actually make a land value tax so that we can collect this? And what Ted did was brilliant. He said, well, you know, this St. Petersburg, the layout reminds me of Boston. So here's a land map. We have a land value map of Boston, and there's a center of values right near the subway, and then it gets lower and lower outside of the subway. Let's just apply that as a scale model and roughly go from there in St. Petersburg. Well, Russia could have been a low-cost economy. It could have kept the oil and the Gazprom, nickel resources, could have kept all that in the public domain to fund the investment in reindustrialization so that it could become independent of the West. Well, as we all know, Ted and the people that Fred Harrison bought are completely overwhelmed by the billions of dollars spent on promoting kleptocracy and shock therapy in Russia. And Russia did not take that path. And it wasn't only Russia. I brought Ted Gwartney along with his mathematical advisor over to Latvia, where I was the economic research director of the Riga Graduate School of Law. And I was asked by the leading political party of Latvia, the Center Party, which was basically the Russian-speaking party, which had 1/3 of the votes, to draw up a model for how Latvia could industrialize. Well, Ted brought his advisor over to the tax authorities and the housing authorities. Had a nice meeting there, and they were amazed. They said, "Oh, this is great! We can hire a separate appraiser for every single building. This will really create a lot of employment." He said, in America, people who do what I do, and Ted was, I think, had been the appraiser for Greenwich, Connecticut, which is the wealthiest city in Connecticut. He said, we can do a whole city in about 1 week. And this, they couldn't believe it in Latvia. Well, shortly after, there was a meeting in Boston of the Eastern Economics Association, and I think the Schachenbach Foundation had a meeting of political critics of Henry George. So there were a lot of Georges there. And the other people who came to the Eastern Economic Association meeting, which was largely created by John Kenneth Galbraith, were socialists. And my friend, who was the assistant to the mayor of London, at that time, Ken Livingstone was the mayor of London, and his assistant was Alan Freeman. So everybody was having lunch after the meetings, economic meetings, and I brought Alan over to sit down with Ted Gwartney. And Ted was saying what he did, and Alan said, "Oh my God, I've never heard of this." Then he came. I've got to come and meet Ted Gwartney. He should, and he came to New York. We went up to Ted Gwartney's house in Connecticut, and Ted explained how you make a land value map. And this is to the assistant of the mayor of London, who wanted initially we talked about their hiring me as the advisor, and Alan said, "Why don't you should win the Nobel Prize for this? This is amazing. This is something." And Ted said, "You know, there are about 20,000 appraisers in America that do this. This is what we do. It's all their ways of doing it. It's all statistics. You can all look it up. Every city has a land. Here's the value of the building. Here's the value of the land. We can make a land value map. That's easy to do. That's what we do mathematically by smoothing out the changes." And Alan couldn't believe it. Well, I went back to London shortly with Alan. And it turned out that the political pressures in England, especially from the Labour Party, that is, I guess, that's on the right wing of the English spectrum, I guess you call it now. They had a real estate company, I forget the name of it, do the appraisal. So we never got to do our version of a real estate appraisal of London, and so that we could really calculate the rent. But this is what, when you think that this is what all of the theories of the physiocrats, Adam Smith, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Marx, Veblen, Alfred Marshall, all of them were focusing on this. And now this idea is so alien that from London to St. Petersburg, they don't have any idea of how this simple concept can be done, because the economics profession is in denial. It's followed the idea that there's no such thing as unearned income. Everybody gets what they make. And so the result, one byproduct of this is how countries calculate their national income accounts, the national income and product accounts, NIPA, or the GDP accounts. And if you look at the GDP accounts for the United States, and I've published a number of articles on my website, and they're in major economic journals to break down what is the GDP. Well, suppose it's easiest to see in real estate and finance. In real estate, the government Department of Labor statistics and other agencies go and ask homeowners, what would the rental income of your home be if you rented out to yourself? If you were a landlord and rented yourself, how much rent would that be? And so they have owners imputed rent, and that's 8% of GDP. That's a lot of GDP, 8%. It's very heavily growing. Well, it's not really income because nobody gets it, but they have to do this because they want to describe all of the income that landlords make as contributing to GDP. They say landlords provide a productive service. They provide housing to people who need it, and they provide commercial properties to businesses that need it. Well, that's not exactly how John Stuart Mill put it when he said rent is what landlords make in their sleep. How do you explain how productive landlords are? Well, another element of America's GDP, and they keep changing this, is imputed financial services. And I called up the Commerce Department where they make the statistics and said, what happens when credit card companies increase their interest charges? And credit card companies in America make about $1 billion in interest a year, and another $1 billion in fees, late fees and penalties. Most of the income that credit card companies make are actually on the fees and penalties. And I said, where does that appear in the GDP? And they said, oh, that is financial services. So the service of calculating how far the debtors are behind in their payments is contribute that this charge that people have to pay, 29% is the rate that they end up paying. That's all a contribution to GDP. So the question is, what does income and product mean? Well, this again is back to what classical economics is all about. The product is what is the actual necessary cost of production is the product. But there's a lot of income over and above the necessary cost of production. And that's economic rent. That's unearned income. That's land rent, monopoly rent, the natural resource rent, interest, and financial charges. And obviously, you want to say how much of what a society produces is actually necessary, is actually a product, and how much is a subtrahend. And the way that we classical economists look at things is to treat the land rent that you pay, the interest charges you pay, the monopoly prices you pay is a rake-off from what you get. It's not all of your income is income equals product. Well, that's not so. Income doesn't equal product because only a portion of that income is a product. In America, the head of Goldman Sachs a few years ago said, Goldman Sachs Partners, it's a financial management firm for essentially...
we know Goldman.
A predatory financial firm. But our partners make more money than anyone else in America because we're the most productive. And again, if you make a lot of money, by definition, you make it by being productive. That's the false identity.
And that's really if you use the phrase, the Clarkian, the John Bates Clark idea that if you make the money, you've earned it. And not just because you control the gate and you're the gatekeeper to stop people or the toll, you're the troll under the bridge taking people's money as they cross or they want to cross, right? Which is essentially what financial economics is about.
Right. Well, I've spoken with a number of political advisors, many of whom were followers of Henry George. And they've described to me how political all of this definition of the economy is. And a number of friends of mine have been trying to work on to show how much of what the United Nations calculates as income and product is actually economic rent. And we all publish together. Steve Keen is one of them. There are a number of others who do it. And we publish in places like the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics and other things, but not the mainstream journals. And essentially, a lot of this was taught where I was a professor for decades. I guess I'm still a professor there at the University of Missouri at Kansas City. And we found that our graduates had problems getting jobs because in order to get an appointment, a job at a university, you have to publish articles in prestige magazines. Well, the University of Chicago, the Milton Friedman boys, the Chicago boys, control the editorial boards of all the prestige magazines, just like they control the Nobel Prize Committee that basically is given to Chicago boys every year for not explaining how the economy works. A precondition for what you call an economist or a Nobel Prize winning economist is not understanding how the economy works, because if you understand it, you're going to threaten the vested interests that are getting the free lunch. You have to say there's no such thing as a free lunch. Everybody earns whatever they get. Robbers and criminals like that idea. Yeah, we got it. We stole it fair and square. You can extend that over the economic spectrum and see that crime pays, but also rent-seeking pays. And you can get much more money quicker by extractive means, by rent extraction, than you can by actually investing in plant and equipment and developing products and marketing them and making a profit over time and spending on research and development. That's why in today's industrial economy in the United States, 92% of corporate revenue called earnings, although not all of it is earned, that's a lot of euphemism, is spent on stock buybacks and dividend payouts, not on new capital investment like the textbooks say. So the way that the economy works today is no longer industrial capitalism. It's finance capitalism. And instead of industrial engineering, making society that produces more with all of the environmental protection in cost included. Instead of that, you have making financial engineering of making wealth by increasing the stock prices. And if you don't realize that wealth is achieved not by earning it, you don't save up your earnings and get wealthy. I think half of Americans are unable to raise $400 in an emergency. They have no savings at all. So it's really very hard to save up money, especially if you have student debt and credit card debt and medical debt and mortgage debt. There's really nothing to be saved. So you have the 1% of society, the rentier portion that had to pay income tax back in 1914, getting huge amounts of income, and the rest of the society getting less and less and less. There's an economic polarization. The dynamics of society are financial, and basically it's rent seeking that has been financialized. I'll give you another example of the GDP. One of the problems that I found makes GDP statistics meaningless is depreciation. This idea that buildings depreciate. When Ronald Reagan came in, this was the real estate interests taking over the government. The Henry George and the libertarians are for central planning, but they're for central planning by Wall Street, by the financial interests. If you don't have every economy is planned, every economy is steered. If you don't have a government strong enough to do the planning is done by the financial sector and the real estate sector. And they had their chance under Ronald Reagan. Under Reagan, you could pretend that if you buy a big commercial building, you can pretend that write off 1/7 of the entire cost every single year. And at the end of 7 years, it ends, and you change your ownership from one name to another name, and you start it all over again. The same building can be redepreciated again and again and again. Donald Trump wrote in his autobiography, he loves depreciation because he said, thanks to the pretense of depreciation, my buildings are all going up in value, and I get to pretend they're falling, and that I get to deduct all of that depreciation from my income tax. And so it's actually economic rent. So if you look at the national income statistics, you can't find economic rent in them at all. They don't. It doesn't appear. I was able to piece it together by adding, what is it that goes into economic rent? Well, certainly real estate taxes are part of economic rent. Interest payments, because interest is paid out of economic rent. The depreciation actually should be there. But the government nowhere in the national income statistics says how much is actually charged for depreciation. They have a dummy, because if they showed that would get the whole economy would think, wait a minute, this is a giveaway. This is utterly unrealistic. And so they pretend that we're going to only put for depreciation what we think the buildings are actually depreciating over a period of 20 or 25 years. It's a completely fictitious number. And so you have a fictitious type of national income accounting that makes it impossible to actually go and calculate what the economic rent is, the economic rent that was the whole focus of classical economics. So how are you going to get a statistical system that actually reflects this? Well, one associate of mine, Jacob Assa, ASSA, has done quite a few books on this, criticizing economic rent. He works for the United Nations here in New York, or did until quite recently. Now he's teaching. So you have people who are capable of doing this, but as I said, our graduates couldn't. You can't publish this in the University of Chicago economic journals because they say there's no such thing as economic rent, just like there's no such thing as society. Now, I had wanted to publish statistics on this, and at a certain point, the Henry George School asked me to make statistics of what rent was and of land value. And I found out that the value of land, market price of land in the United States, was twice what the government reported it as. The government pretends that buildings keep growing in value, even though there's depreciation. They pretend that buildings are growing in value, and whatever is left after putting you take the original cost of the building, you multiply it by the construction price index, and whatever is left is the land value. Well, in 1994, if you were to ask what's the land value of all of the commercially owned real estate in the United States, what do you think it was? It was negative $4 billion. In other words, we will give you all of the land that every corporation owns in the United States. But you'll have to accept the $4 billion that it's in deficit for. I mean, this is crazy. The statistics are drawn up by the real estate interests. And when I calculated this, the Georgists in America got furious. They said, this is awful. You're showing that rents much more and land value and rents are much higher than we thought. If you did this, people are going to want to tax them. We represent the developers. Our followers in the Georgist movement are the local mayors, and in order to influence local mayors, you have to, their big funders are the real estate interests in their campaigns. We represent the developers. We want to save society by having the developers build up those slums, build up those vacant lots. That'll save civilization. You don't need to worry about ecology. You don't need to worry about workers' conditions. You don't need to worry about anything about let's build up those vacant lots. Well, that's when I was told if I publish these statistics, I can never have any relations with Schockenbach or the Henry George School again. So I published them in at Harper's Magazine in a cover story and lived happily ever after.
And was that the new road to serfdom?
Did I what?
The article in Harper's, was that the new road to serfdom that you?
Yes.
Okay.
We're in the new road to serfdom because the purpose of industrial capitalism was to free economies from the legacy of feudalism. And the legacy of feudalism was the landlord warrior class collecting hereditary rents, and the predatory banks that were not making loans for industry. None of the industrialists got their money to invest in banks. The inventors of the steam engine couldn't get money; they had to mortgage their houses. Banks don't lend money for that.
And this is all included in your very latest book that's only just come out, which is The Destiny of Civilization: Finance Capitalism, Industrial Capitalism, or Socialism, which I think was a series of lectures to a Chinese university. Is that correct?
Yes. And there are 168,000 viewers of the first lecture in the first week, and there's a huge interest in this in China because they realize we don't need higher housing prices. Right now, what is pushing up housing prices in China? It's the amount of money that banks will lend against the property. And if you have a land tax, the land tax will actually keep the prices of housing down. Because if obviously as China gets more productive and more prosperous, people are going to be able to afford housing. And housing is really how you define a person's status. If something gets more valuable because of public investment in transportation or schools nearby or parks nearby, that's going to make it more valuable. But if you tax it, then you're going to keep the actual housing price down, and what you're paying for is the economic rent. But the economic rent is the payment that pays for all of these. I think Fred Harrison and Riley wrote that book, Taken for a Ride, where they show that all of the money that London spent on extending the Jubilee line increased real estate prices by twice as much all along the line. They could have simply collected the value that this public investment created as Simon Patton pointed out, and made it self-financing. Instead, it was all a giveaway, and they had to end up taxing labor and business, and that obviously increased. The effect was to increase Britain's cost of living and hence the cost of production, which is why Britain has been deindustrializing. And it's been deindustrializing because despite the attempt through 1909 and 10 to free itself from landlordism, it freed itself from landlordism only to have the bankers taking the place of the landlords and being the class today that was what the landlords were in the 19th century. And so we're back on the revival of what really was feudalism, a rake-off by a hereditary privileged class.
Thank you for listening to the Shepheard Walwyn podcast. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit our website www.shepherdwalwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are also on the website. And if you like the podcast, please head over to iTunes or Spotify to give us a review. It's surprisingly helpful in getting the ideas out there. So until next time, keep reading